The movie begins on the festive morning of Christmas. At that time, a shocking discovery was made on the rooftop of an apartment building. The police stumbled upon the lifeless body of a teenage boy named Wal-woo inside a tank, and they were unable to determine the cause of his death, ultimately ruling it as an accident. However, Wal-woo's twin brother, Il-woo, couldn't accept this outcome. Convinced that his brother had been murdered, he was determined to seek revenge against whoever was responsible. To get closer to the truth, Il-woo planned and carried out a minor crime, resulting in his arrest and placement in the juvenile detention center, where he believed the perpetrator to be hiding. Upon entering the prison, Il-woo is directed to meet with Cho Soon-woo, the person who will guide him through the next 2 years as both his teacher and therapist. As Cho studies Il-woo's personal records, he learns of the unfortunate events that led to Il-woo's imprisonment. He discovers that Il-woo was expelled from school and was living with his grandmother and brother, Wal-woo. Tragically, both his grandmother and Wal-woo have passed away, with Il-woo still feeling the pain of losing his grandmother just a week after Wal-woo's death, who was found lifeless while clutching his photo. Feeling remorseful for not being aware of Il-woo's grandmother's passing, Cho turns off his tape recorder and delves deeper into the subject of Wal-woo's death. He is convinced that Il-woo harbors suspicion that his twin did not die from an accident but was murdered instead. Furthermore, Cho realizes that Il-woo purposely landed himself in prison to seek revenge against the 4 individuals who he believes were responsible for Wal-woo's death. As Cho spoke, Il-woo was reminded of the moment when he had attended Wal-woo's funeral and broke down in tears. Then Cho confesses that he was well acquainted with Il-woo's brother and grandmother, having regularly taken part in volunteer work that involved visiting their apartment every week to deliver instant noodles. He pleads with Il-woo to abandon his quest for revenge and move on, but Il-woo responds with anger, bristling at the idea of being lectured and resenting Cho's intrusion into his family's life. Il-woo makes it clear that he will do as he pleases and won't allow Cho to interfere. Cho realizes that further argument is futile and instead brings Il-woo to class, where he introduces him to the other prisoners. However, just as Il-woo takes his seat, he suddenly stands up and charges towards the boy sitting in the corner of the room. The attempt is unsuccessful, and the other prisoners quickly restrain Il-woo, administering a beating until the officers arrive and forcibly remove him from the scene. The officers rounded up Il-woo and the other prisoners who were involved in a scuffle in the corridor. One of the officers, Han Hee-sung, then demanded that anyone who felt remorseful should bark like a dog. The other prisoners followed Han's instructions, but Il-woo remained silent as he felt he was innocent. Han's anger boiled over and he demanded that Il-woo stand up. Han then proceeded to physically assault Il-woo, but Il-woo tried to escape. However, the other officers caught him and he cried out in agony as Han continued to beat him with a baton. The other prisoners were powerless to intervene, but one prisoner, Moon Ja-hoon, who Il-woo was about to attack earlier, seemed pleased with the situation, even cracking a smile upon hearing his screams of pain. Thankfully, the abuse was short-lived. Cho intervened and stopped Han from further assaulting Il-woo, but Han still had him placed in solitary confinement. While in solitary confinement, Il-woo was consumed by intense pain that reminded him of the memory of his twin brother Wal-woo's death. His face was badly bruised, but volunteer workers suggested that Wal-woo may have inflicted the injuries upon himself due to his autism. Hearing that theory only fueled Il-woo's anger, as he was certain that Wal-woo was beaten by someone else. The following day, Il-woo was finally released from the isolation room and received medical attention. He took advantage of the situation and stole bandages and a knife. Then he wrapped the bandages around his hand to conceal the weapon. Shortly after, Il-woo made his way to the restroom. Coincidentally, 2 of Ja-hoon's accomplices were there and one of them was in a toilet stall. Not realizing that Il-woo was nearby, the man spoke poorly of him, saying that he was acting like his deceased twin. Enraged, he quickly silenced the man's friend who was waiting outside the bathroom, instructing him to be quiet. Then he entered the bathroom and listened as the man bragged about beating Wal-woo. Fueled by anger, Il-woo emerged from the stall brandishing the knife, confronting the man and demanding to know if he was responsible for Wal-woo's death. The man denied the accusation, stating that he and his friends had encountered Wal-woo and beat him, but did not kill him. The commotion that erupted in the bathroom eventually caught the attention of Cho and the officers, who tried to persuade Il-woo to come out of the stall, but he refused, instead choosing to attack the man and inflict a wound on his face. It was then that Cho broke down the stall door and physically restrained him, pleading with him to calm down. Eventually, Il-woo was locked in isolation for 1 more day. Later that night, while Il-woo was asleep in isolation, Ja-hoon's accomplice snuck in and brutally beat him with a wrench. Despite being aware of the attack, Han watched idly as Il-woo was beaten and seriously injured. The sight of Il-woo drenched in blood sends the attacker into a state of panic. But before he can flee, Il-woo rises to his feet and retaliates. Now certain that the man was responsible for Wal-woo's death, Il-woo continues to pummel him as he demands answers. However, the man vehemently denies having killed Wal-woo. He explains that on that fateful Christmas Eve, he, Ja-hoon, and 2 others had come across Wal-woo while he was working at the convenience store. They threatened him with a beating in an effort to steal items from the store without Wal-woo reporting them to the police or the store owner. He swears that they only beat Wal-woo and did not kill him. But Il-woo refuses to believe the man's story and extracts 2 of his teeth with pliers. Han's arrival puts an end to Il-woo's revenge as he raises his hands in surrender. But instead of arresting him, Han stuns Il-woo with a stun gun. The following day, the attacker with severe injuries was brought to the hospital for treatment. In an effort to cover his tracks, Han instructed all the prisoners to lie and say that the man's teeth were knocked out during an ordinary physical activity. He was determined to keep his involvement in the attack on Il-woo a secret from his superiors. He also proposed that Il-woo be transferred to a different juvenile detention center, making it impossible for Il-woo to seek revenge on Ja-hoon. While nursing his wounds, Cho informed Il-woo of Han's plan to transfer him. This would prevent Il-woo from seeking retribution against Ja-hoon. Cho couldn't help but question the true motives behind Ja-hoon and his friends. Were they truly behind Wal-woo's murder? Despite being locked up in the detention center for minor offenses, did they intentionally commit these crimes to avoid punishment for Wal-woo's death? Il-woo is convinced that Ja-hoon and his accomplices are responsible for Wal-woo's murder. He believes this due to hearing a suspicious background noise during his last phone call with Wal-woo on Christmas Eve and their sight in the convenience store, captured by the store's CCTV footage. He believes that they beat Wal-woo to death and then staged a minor crime near the police station, resulting in their arrest before Wal-woo's body was discovered. As Il-woo shared his theory with Cho, the latter listened intently. Upon the conclusion of that story, Cho implored him to abandon his plan for revenge. He feared that Il-woo would become like Ja-hoon and his friends, consumed by a cycle of violence. However, Il-woo was unwavering in his resolve to seek justice for Wal-woo and refused to heed Cho's warnings. He was determined to make Ja-hoon and his accomplices pay for what they had done to his brother. Faced with Il-woo's unyielding attitude, Cho came up with a plan. He tasked Il-woo with writing a letter of apology for his disruptive behavior from the previous day and gave him one last chance to change his ways. If Il-woo caused any more trouble, Cho warned that he would have no choice but to transfer Il-woo to another juvenile detention center. The following day, Il-woo was granted the privilege of returning to his classes with increased supervision. He was seated next to an inmate named Son-hwan, who was frequently subjected to bullying by Ja-hoon and his gang. This was evident during lunchtime, when they tormented Son-hwan, who passively accepted the abuse. Il-woo watched from a distance, unwilling to intervene. Later that night, Il-woo participated in a therapy session with Cho in his room. As he looked around, his gaze was drawn to a Santa Claus costume in the corner. Noticing Il-woo's fascination with the costume, Cho explained that he had visited Wal-woo's apartment last Christmas dressed as Santa Claus. He fondly remembered Wal-woo's joyful smile whenever they met, but he still couldn't comprehend why things had ended the way they did. Cho tried to reason with Il-woo, suggesting that even if Ja-hoon and his friends were responsible for Wal-woo's death, it was likely not intentional. People make mistakes, and they shouldn't be labeled as criminals forever because of it. But Il-woo was resolute in his stance, feeling that as the victim, he should not have to forgive the killers. Cho realized that if he were in Il-woo's shoes, he probably wouldn't forgive them either, especially since they showed no remorse for their actions and even tried to harm Il-woo. However, he still firmly believed that violence is not the solution. If there was any way he could help Il-woo, he would do so, but taking another life is not the answer. As Il-woo entered the laundry room, he heard a muffled moan coming from the adjacent room. The door was locked, so he decided to wait and see who would emerge. Soon after, Han and Son-hwan appeared, but quickly turned off the lights. However, he was able to recognize them. At that time, Son-hwan was holding 2 packs of cigarettes, which he intended to distribute to the other inmates. But the other inmates were not satisfied, complaining that the cigarettes were not enough. Ja-hoon, in particular, was displeased with him, as the way he was looking at him reminded Ja-hoon of Il-woo. In a fit of anger, Ja-hoon began to beat Son-hwan and demanded that he stop looking at him in that manner. Then he ordered Son-hwan to take off his pants, and Son-hwan, who was used to such treatment from Han, obeyed while the other prisoners laughed at his distress. The following day, Il-woo stumbled upon Son-hwan as he stood outside smoking by himself. Il-woo attempted to engage in conversation with him, and mentioned that he was aware Son-hwan had obtained the cigarettes from Han the previous night. He also inferred that Son-hwan didn't particularly want to serve Han, but was forced to do so because of Ja-hoon's threat. At that time, he found himself pondering why someone as frail as Son-hwan would end up in a detention center. Despite Il-woo's efforts to initiate conversation, Son-hwan didn't respond to his questions. Instead, he turned the tables and asked why Il-woo was imprisoned. To his knowledge, Il-woo didn't seem like someone who would take revenge for his twin brother, Wal-woo's death. Son-hwan then disclosed that he was familiar with Wal-woo as they used to live in the same apartment building and were actually friends. He even knew that on the day Wal-woo passed away, Il-woo had promised to meet him at a restaurant but never showed up. This resulted in Wal-woo going to work instead. At that time, he was aware of these events as he was present at the restaurant with Wal-woo. Il-woo's anger boiled over upon hearing the truth from Son-hwan. He blamed San Huan for allowing Wal-woo to go to work that fateful day, despite Il-woo having instructed him to wait at the restaurant. If Wal-woo had followed his instructions, he wouldn't have met his untimely demise. Enraged, Il-woo was on the brink of physically assaulting San Huan. However, he ultimately settled for throwing him to the ground before storming off. Meanwhile, Han was in the middle of brutalizing a new inmate named Bong Chan. But instead of showing fear, he wore a smile and warned Han that he knew about his secret scandal with San Huan. He threatened to expose the truth if Han continued his attack. This caused Han to back off. He brought Bong Chan to the cell and introduced him to the other prisoners. The first thing Bong Chan did was attack one of the inmates viciously, leaving them badly beaten. Han stood by and watched the violence unfold without intervening. It wasn't until Bong Chan stopped the attack that Han took the injured prisoner to the medical room. After their departure, Il-woo was greeted by Bong Chan, who turned out to be an acquaintance from the past. He was originally serving time in another juvenile detention center, but was transferred to this facility at Ja-hoon's request. Ja-hoon's father, a wealthy lawyer, easily facilitated the transfer. Ja-hoon wanted Bong Chan to carry out his dirty work and eliminate Il-woo, as he feared that Il-woo had intentions to kill him. Ja-hoon confided in his friends about his plan, not realizing that San Huan was listening in. The following day, San Huan informed Il-woo of the danger, much to his surprise. He was also taken aback by San Huan's sudden concern for him, despite previously showing a negative attitude. Taking advantage of the opportunity, he used the opportunity to question San Huan about Wal-woo's death and why he let him go that day. During the chaos, memories of the past come flooding back to Il-woo as he watches Bong Chan's brutality. He recalls a time when he and Bong Chan were part of a group that would beat people up for money. However, Il-woo soon realizes that this is not a job he wants to continue and decides to take action to protect San Huan and the other inmates from further harm. Meanwhile, San Huan confides in Il-woo about what really happened on the fateful day of Wal-woo's death. He explains that he and Wal-woo were waiting at the restaurant for Il-woo, but when he never showed up or answered their calls, Wal-woo decided to go to work. Despite San Huan's efforts to persuade him otherwise, Wal-woo went to work as he needed the money. San Huan also shares his belief that Ja-hoon is not the one responsible for Wal-woo's death, even though he did transfer Bong Chan to the detention center with the intention of having him kill Il-woo. However, with Il-woo now aware of the danger and San Huan's newfound concern for his safety, they joined forces to protect themselves and the other inmates from the violence that seems to constantly surround them. Moments later, Bong Chan had finally had enough of punishing the two inmates. With the other prisoners in tow, he left the room, leaving Il-woo behind to deal with the aftermath. As Il-woo struggled to regain his composure, he suddenly heard a groan of pain coming from the front of the room. To his surprise, he found that there was still one person left in the room, and it was one of the prisoners who had been beaten by Bong Chan. Moved by the man's suffering, Il-woo felt a sense of compassion and took him to the infirmary to tend to his wounds. The man apologized to Il-woo, explaining that he was a friend of Ja-hoon's but had no involvement in the violence against Wal-woo on that fateful Christmas Eve. Il-woo, however, remained silent, choosing to focus on treating the man's injuries. As Il-woo trudged back to his cell, he couldn't help but be reminded of the tragedy that befell Wal-woo. He remembered the night he received a frantic call from Wal-woo, who was working at the convenience store alone. The terror in Wal-woo's voice was palpable, but before he could explain what was wrong, Ja-hoon and his friends burst into the store and covered the CCTV cameras. The call was still connected, and Il-woo could hear everything that was happening. Ja-hoon and his friends intended to rob the store, but they didn't want Wal-woo to report them to the police, so they savagely beat him instead. At that moment, he was powerless to do anything but listen in horror as they brutalized Wal-woo. The memory of Wal-woo's death fueled Il-woo's thirst for revenge. He went to Cho's room and begged him to help him get justice for his fallen friend. Despite initial reluctance, Cho ultimately agreed to help Il-woo, who reminded him of Wal-woo and the gruesome way he died. Then he handed over the keys to all the rooms in the facility, which Il-woo gratefully accepted. However, Il-woo only took one key with him and headed for the room next to the laundry. As he approached the room, he heard a familiar moaning sound, and his mind was immediately transported back to the memory of Wal-woo's last moments. Il-woo had previously noticed Wal-woo wincing in pain, but he refused to explain the source of his discomfort. Instead, he apologized for any noise he may have made that bothered Il-woo. To this, Il-woo replied that there was no need to make any noise if he was not in pain. Now, as Il-woo approached the source of the groaning, he was horrified to find Han assaulting San Huan. Without hesitation, he used a stun gun on Han and violently attacked Han in a fit of rage. He was angrier with himself for not realizing sooner the source of Wal-woo's pain. To confirm his suspicion, Il-woo questioned San Huan, who confirmed that Wal-woo had been a victim of harassment. Despite this, he kept the information from Il-woo, not wanting to burden him with his problems. Recalling the past events, Il-woo feels a wave of anger and regret wash over him. He rues the fact that Wal-woo didn't confide in him about the harassment he was facing. When asked by San Huan if he would have done the same in Wal-woo's shoes, Il-woo falls silent. Then Il-woo begins to think about the fateful day of Wal-woo's death. He was occupied with work, forcibly evicting residents who opposed the demolition of their homes. Desperate to earn money for his family, Il-woo worked extra shifts, only to be denied a bonus by his boss. It was only Bong-chan's intervention that got him the bonus. By the time Il-woo finished work and made it home, it was already dark. He was reminded of his dinner appointment with Wal-woo and immediately tried to call him. But to his horror, he could hear Wal-woo being beaten by Ja-hoon and his accomplices through the phone. The recollection of these events brings tears to his eyes as he realizes the cruel reality that he was unable to save his brother. The following day, Ja-hoon receives a visit from his mother, who informs him that he will be transferred to another facility the following week. The news does not bring him comfort, especially when he hears that Han has abruptly quit his job. Then he turns to Bong-chan and asks about the status of his plan to kill Il-woo, but Bong-chan has yet to make any concrete arrangements. At that time, he grows frustrated as he paid a hefty price for Bong-chan's services and knows his father will take actions against him if he fails to deliver. Then Ja-hoon becomes suspicious of Son-hwan and demands to know what happened to Han. Son-hwan initially denies knowing anything, but Ja-hoon does not believe him and orders him to meet him in the bathroom for a private conversation. However, Il-woo intervenes, warning Son-hwan that he would be putting himself in danger if he goes to meet Ja-hoon. Instead, he suggests that Son-hwan meet with Cho after class when it's time for the inmates to shower. Hearing that, Son-hwan agrees with Il-woo's advice and returns to his seat. In gratitude for his assistance, Son-hwan finally reveals to him the reason why Wal-woo was working at the convenience store, to support him financially and relieve the burden of supporting his family solely. Even if Il-woo were to meet Wal-woo on Christmas Eve, Wal-woo would still go to work. As the day wore on, Il-woo put his revenge plan into action, targeting Ja-hoon and his accomplices during their shower time. He had coordinated with Cho the night before, who informed him that he had a mere 40 minutes to carry out the attack before the guards would discover him. As the inmates entered the bathroom, Il-woo ordered everyone except for Ja-hoon and his friends to leave. With just the 4 of them remaining in the room, Il-woo confronted Ja-hoon, asking if he was the one who killed Wal-woo and put him in the water tank. However, he responded by shattering the mirror, grabbing one of the shards, and pointing it menacingly at Il-woo. He declared that he had no regret for what he did to Wal-woo. Meanwhile, Son-hwan and Cho were in Cho's room, feeling nervous about Il-woo's actions. To pass the time, Cho asked him to do some therapy drawings. Then he quickly drew a red triangle and a black circle, which he explained symbolized his weakness as a person. In the bathroom, Il-woo was in for the fight of his life when he faced off against 4 men in the bathroom. Despite being stabbed by Ja-hoon with a glass shard, Il-woo didn't give up and managed to defeat 3 of the attackers with the last of his strength. Despite being in pain, Il-woo still had the determination to take down Ja-hoon, but he lacked the energy to finish the job. That's when Cho, who had unexpectedly entered the bathroom, stepped in and took matters into his own hands with an iron pipe, killing Ja-hoon and his 3 friends. At that time, Il-woo was left shocked and bewildered by the sight, but before he could even ask why, he passed out. He was taken to the hospital for treatment, with Son-hwan by his side the entire time. Meanwhile, Cho was arrested and accepted his punishment for his actions, resigned to pay for his sins. However, it turned out that Cho's atrocities were not limited to the murder of 4 individuals. During Cho's trial, Son-hwan abruptly approached him and spat at him while tossing a piece of paper in his direction. As Cho picked up the paper, he was taken aback by the drawing, which reminded him of a harrowing event from the past. The illustration depicted the moment when Cho, disguised as Santa Claus, visited Wal-woo's apartment. Peering through the bathroom window, he ordered Wal-woo to disrobe before proceeding to commit unspeakable acts upon him. Son-hwan, who was nearby, was horrified as he listened to Wal-woo's distress through the glass. The drawing that he created during therapy was a portrayal of the Santa Claus hat he witnessed through the window. Despite his hatred for Cho, he is grateful for the fact that Cho killed the individuals responsible for Wal-woo's death. Following Son-hwan's removal, Cho was sentenced to serve 4 years in prison. On the other hand, when Il-woo eventually recovered from his injuries and was returned to the detention center, a memory of Wal-woo surfaced. Wal-woo had previously shared with him a story about a Santa Claus who visited him, bearing instant noodles and expressing affection for him. As Wal-woo was about to continue his tale, Il-woo cut him off, saying he wanted to sleep. In response, Wal-woo requested to sing Christmas carols for him instead. Despite the tears that intermittently interrupted his performance, Wal-woo serenaded Il-woo, who covered his ears in response. At that time, Il-woo was unaware of the reason for Wal-woo's crying during his singing. However, he now understands and comprehends why Cho visited Wal-woo every week, dressed in a Santa Claus costume. Wal-woo had previously told Cho that Santa Claus liked him. Driven by suspicion, Il-woo visits Cho in prison to confirm his doubts. When asked if he was responsible for Wal-woo's death, Cho denies the allegations, but admits to having affection for Wal-woo. He explains that he volunteered at the detention center as a means of seeking revenge against Ja-hoon and his accomplices, who had previously beaten Wal-woo. However, Il-woo's arrival complicated matters, but Cho ultimately made the decision to protect him from becoming a killer himself by eliminating Ja-hoon and his friends. This, in his mind, was a way of repaying his debt to Wal-woo. Cho desires for Il-woo to move on with his life, as he believes it is what Wal-woo would have wanted. However, his words only serve to enrage Il-woo, who demands the truth behind Wal-woo's death. Before he could offer an explanation, Il-woo was taken away by the guards. The scene shifts to a depiction of events that took place on the night of December 24th. At that time, Wal-woo is beaten by Ja-hoon and his crew and returns to the convenience store to find it in disarray. Fearful of being fired, he attempts to clean up the mess but realizes it's a futile effort. In his moment of confusion, Cho arrives and takes him to the roof of an apartment building. However, when he tries to take advantage of the situation, Wal-woo fights back and the struggle results in Wal-woo's accidental death. In his panic, Cho cries as he places Wal-woo's body in a tank. Feeling that he has atoned for his sin, Cho decides to live out his sentence quietly until his release from prison. However, his peaceful existence is disrupted when a fellow inmate approaches him, claiming to have been sent by Ja-hoon's father to deal with him. This realization marks the moment when he realizes that his fate is sealed. After spending a year in detention, Il-woo is finally a free man. He makes a visit to his former apartment, now home to a new family, including a child with an intellectual disability like Wal-woo's. Il-woo then ascends to the roof of the building with Son-hwan, where they pay homage to Wal-woo by singing a Christmas carol that he used to perform. And with this final moment, the film ends. The moral that can be learned from this movie is about redemption and the consequences of one's actions. Besides that, we have to make amends for past wrongdoings and the need to find a path towards forgiveness and healing.